The phone rang late that night. I didn't recognize the number at first, but something about the silence before the call connected gave me chills. Then I heard her voice, my mother's voice. "Since you're finally earning something," she said, without even saying hello, "it's your duty to take care of us. Don't forget, you wouldn't even be alive if it weren't for us." For a second, I couldn't breathe. Her words felt like a slap across the face. Duty? Support? This was coming from the same woman who laughed at me when I couldn't afford lunch in high school, who called me a beggar when I worked 2 jobs just to pay for textbooks. Suddenly, after years of silence and ridicule, I was no longer invisible. I was a paycheck. That's when I knew. This story wasn't going to end like the others. And if you've ever had someone use your success after mocking your struggle, you'll understand exactly why this moment broke me. And hey, if stories like this resonate with you, hit that subscribe button. You'll see why as we go deeper. I stayed silent on the phone, gripping it so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mother continued, her tone sharper with each word. "Your brother says you bought a house, a real house. Do you know how selfish it is, hiding that from us? You should be grateful we raised you. Now it's your turn to give back." Grateful. That word twisted in my chest. My entire childhood had been a battlefield of insults and rejection. Grateful for what? For being told I wasn't smart enough for college? For the endless nights when I went hungry because they forgot to cook for me? For the years when I was treated more like an outsider than a son? I wanted to scream. But instead, I just listened. Every word she threw at me felt like it carried the weight of every insult I'd ever heard growing up. "Don't think you can turn your back on family," she snapped. "Blood is blood, whether you like it or not." I wanted to laugh. Blood is blood? Where was that belief when they kicked me out at 17 with nothing but a backpack and a handful of coins in my pocket? Where was family when I spent nights sleeping on a friend's couch, when my so-called relatives spread rumors about how pathetic I was? The hypocrisy burned me from the inside. And as much as I hated to admit it, part of me still wanted her approval, still wanted her to see me, not as a wallet, not as a mistake, but as a person. But I wasn't that helpless kid anymore. The one they mocked for being poor, the one they swore would never make it. I had survived all of that. And now, because I had something, they thought I owed them everything. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady but low. "You only call me when you want something. You never cared when I had nothing. Why now?" There was a pause on the other end. For the first time, she didn't have a quick answer. But then, like clockwork, the guilt-tripping began. "Don't disrespect me. You'll regret turning your back on family." That was the night everything shifted. The night I realized that the people who should have lifted me up never intended to. They only wanted to pull me back down. And that was just the beginning. I was never the child who stood out. If anything, I learned very early how to disappear. In school pictures, you'd find me standing on the far edge, half hidden behind taller kids, my clothes a little too worn, my shoes scuffed in ways that could never be polished out. I didn't blend in because I wanted to. I blended in because invisibility felt safer than being noticed. At home, invisibility wasn't just a habit. It was survival. My siblings had louder voices, sharper personalities, and in the eyes of my parents, brighter futures. I was the one who slipped through the cracks, the one they never bragged about, the one they never introduced proudly to family friends. If my name came up at all, it was usually followed by a sigh or a complaint. I existed more as a shadow than a person. There were days when it felt like my presence in the house was an inconvenience. Meals would be cooked and finished before I even got the chance to sit at the table. clothes would be passed down to me long after they'd been worn thin, as if I wasn't worth anything new. Even in birthdays, when other kids had balloons and laughter, mine passed quietly, sometimes unnoticed entirely. I remember once hiding in my room all day just to see if anyone would come find me. Nobody did. Being invisible meant I could hear everything without anyone realizing I was listening. I heard the way my parents compared me to others, how my cousins were destined for great things while I was just average. I heard my father tell people that he didn't expect much from me, that some kids were simply born without ambition. And every time those words sank into my skin, I retreated further into myself, believing that maybe they were right. School didn't offer much relief either. I wasn't the smart one, or the athletic one, or even the troublemaker who got attention through rebellion. I was just there. Teachers barely remembered my name, classmates forgot to invite me to parties, and I became so accustomed to silence that even when I wanted to speak, the words tangled and died in my throat. I was the kid who sat in the back, doing assignments quietly, hoping no one would notice the holes in my sneakers or the way my stomach growled when I didn't have lunch money. But what cut deepest wasn't the neglect. It was the mockery. My own siblings laughed at the way I dressed, imitating the way I walked or exaggerating the way I hesitated before speaking. They had inside jokes at my expense, jokes my parents didn't bother to stop. Sometimes my father even joined in, shaking his head and saying I had been born with no backbone. Those words stuck like a tattoo I couldn't erase. Still, invisibility gave me something too. Time. Time to observe, time to dream, time to imagine a life where I wasn't the forgotten one. When the house grew loud with arguments and I was left out of the chaos, I sat in the corner sketching ideas in old notebooks, scribbling goals that felt impossible but necessary. I wrote down promises to myself, promises that one day I would matter, even if it wasn't to them. But those promises were fragile against the weight of reality. Every day was a reminder that I didn't belong, not in my family, not in the classroom, not anywhere. Even the smallest victories, like earning a good grade or finishing a difficult assignment, were met with indifference at home. My siblings' achievements were celebrated with cakes, photos, and praise, while mine passed unnoticed. Sometimes I wondered if I had to fail spectacularly just to be acknowledged. The loneliness was crushing. I remember nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining what it would feel like if someone, anyone, truly saw me. Not the version they had already written in their minds, but me, the kid who tried, who worked hard, who dreamed quietly in the background. I longed for a moment when someone would say they were proud, when I could feel even a flicker of belonging. Instead, I learned to shrink myself further, because invisibility hurt less than rejection. The fewer expectations I had of being noticed, the fewer disappointments I carried. By the time I was a teenager, being overlooked had become second nature. I didn't complain when I was left behind. I didn't argue when I was excluded. I simply accepted it as my role, the invisible child, the family's forgotten shadow. Looking back now, I see how those years shaped me in ways I didn't understand at the time. Invisibility taught me to endure, to survive without recognition, to find strength in silence. It gave me resilience, even if it came wrapped in pain. But it also left scars that never fully healed. The constant question of whether I was ever enough, or whether I was destined to be invisible forever. And maybe that's why, later, when I finally began to build something of my own, when I finally started to rise out of poverty and prove them wrong, the irony cut so deep. For years, I was nothing but a shadow. And yet, the moment I had something worth taking, Suddenly, everyone saw me. Suddenly, I wasn't invisible anymore. That was the cruelest twist of all. I had spent my whole life waiting to be noticed, and when they finally did notice me, it wasn't for who I was. It was for what I had, and that realization would change everything. If childhood was defined by invisibility, my teenage years were defined by humiliation. Poverty stopped being something that only I noticed. It became a spectacle for others to mock, a label stamped on my back that I could never peel off. By the time I was 14, I had already accepted that if I wanted anything, clothes that fit, supplies for school, even just lunch money, I would have to earn it myself. I took whatever odd jobs I could find. I mowed lawns for neighbors, cleaned kitchens after hours at a diner, and spent weekends hauling boxes in a dusty warehouse for wages so low they barely covered the bus ride. The work was exhausting, but there was a strange pride in knowing that I was at least trying. That pride, however, was invisible to the people around me. What they saw wasn't my effort, but my failure. My classmates mocked me for the way I smelled after long shifts, for the grease stains that clung to my clothes, for the fact that I couldn't afford the things they considered basic. They wore brand-name shoes and laughed at my second-hand sneakers. They carried phones and gadgets while I counted coins just to afford a notebook. But it wasn't just school that was cruel, it was home too. My siblings joked about how pathetic it was that I worked for pocket change, while they coasted comfortably on the little attention and support my parents gave them. My father shook his head when I came home late from a shift, as if my effort was proof of weakness rather than resilience. Every hour I spent working, every blister on my hands, became another reason for them to look down on me. Humiliation became routine. At the diner where I cleaned tables, classmates sometimes came in with their families, pointing me out as if I were part of the decor. At the warehouse, adults half drunk on cheap beer tossed jokes at me about being too small for real work. Even the neighbors whispered about me, telling their children not to end up like that boy always running around doing scraps of work. No matter how hard I tried, I was never respected. I was entertainment. But the worst part was the hunger. There were days when I worked 3 shifts and still couldn't afford more than a pack of instant noodles. I would ration them, stretching one meal into 2, convincing myself I wasn't hungry when my stomach ached. Sometimes, when classmates tossed away half-eaten sandwiches, I stared longer than I should have, ashamed of the way I envied their waste. The humiliation of poverty wasn't just in what others saw. It was in the way I felt every time my body betrayed me with a growl I couldn't silence. Still, I endured. I told myself it was temporary, that humiliation was only a stage I had to pass through, that one day I would rise above it. But those years dragged on endlessly. And with each passing season, the weight of being seen as nothing pressed harder on my shoulders. School dances, field trips, even simple outings with friends, those were luxuries I couldn't afford. I watched from the sidelines as others created memories while I stacked plates, scrubbed floors, and folded uniforms for money I would spend before I even earned it. I told myself I didn't care, but deep down, I carried a quiet ache for the normal experiences everyone else seemed to take for granted. The most painful moments weren't the jeers or the gossip, but the silence from the people who should have defended me. My family never once told me they were proud, never once acknowledged the sacrifices I was making just to survive. Instead, they twisted every effort into another insult. To them, I wasn't hardworking, I was desperate. I wasn't resilient, I was pathetic. They didn't see my small victories. They only saw how little they amounted to compared to what they thought I should have been. And yet, as cruel as those years were, they hardened me. Every insult, every laugh, Every dismissive look forged something in me that I didn't fully understand at the time. I was learning to live without validation. I was learning to stand on ground that nobody else wanted to share with me. I was learning that humiliation, as crushing as it felt, couldn't break me unless I let it. There were nights when I collapsed into bed, exhausted and defeated, wondering if this would be my life forever. Would I always be the one people mocked? Would I always be working myself to the bone just to stay one step ahead of hunger? Would I ever be more than the butt of someone's joke? Those nights were dark, but they planted a seed. The humiliation I carried became fuel. Every sneer I endured made me more determined to escape. Every laugh at my expense became a silent promise that one day I would no longer be the one people looked down on. I didn't know how or when, but I knew I couldn't stay in that place forever. Humiliation had broken down pieces of me, but it had also lit a fire I couldn't put out. A fire that whispered to me in the quiet moments, "This isn't all there is. Keep going. Keep fighting." Those years carved scars into me that I still carry, but they also gave me the resilience I would later need. I didn't realize it at the time, but the very things that made me the family disgrace, the very struggles that made me the subject of ridicule, were slowly shaping the strength I would one day rely on. And that strength would be tested, because humiliation was only the beginning. By the time I reached the end of high school, I had learned how to survive humiliation, but survival wasn't enough anymore. I carried inside me a fragile dream, one I kept hidden like a secret too delicate for the world to touch. I wanted to go to college. The idea had been growing quietly for years, watered by late nights studying in dim light and afternoons in the library where I could escape into books that promised there was more to life than the one I knew. In those pages, I saw possibility. I saw people who rose from nothing and built something of their own. I told myself that maybe, just maybe, that could be me too. But dreams didn't come cheap, and mine felt impossibly expensive. Tuition, books, housing, all numbers that looked like mountains I could never climb. I counted my savings again and again, stacking crumpled bills from endless shifts, but the pile never seemed to grow. Each dollar felt like a grain of sand slipping through my fingers, never enough to build the foundation I needed. The doubt wasn't just financial. It lived in me too. After years of being told I wasn't enough, the voices had taken root inside my own head. Whenever I let myself imagine walking across a campus, the thought was quickly drowned out by the echo of every insult I'd ever heard. I told myself I was too average, too poor, too broken to belong in a place like that. Still, the dream refused to die. It sat heavy on my chest every time I passed a school building. Every time I saw other kids talking about their plans, filling out applications with the kind of confidence I couldn't even fake. They spoke of futures with certainty while I wrestled with the possibility of even having one. There were nights when I would sit in silence, staring at the ceiling, trying to picture myself anywhere but where I was. I imagined classrooms filled with people who didn't know my history, professors who didn't care about my last name or my hand-me-down clothes. A life where I could finally prove that I wasn't the nothing my family believed me to be. But the more I dreamed, the more the doubts twisted around me like chains. Every shift at the diner reminded me how small I was in the grand scheme of things. Every sneer from a classmate reminded me how far I still had to go. Every indifferent glance from my family reminded me that no one believed in me, not even the people who should have been my first cheerleaders. I started to wonder if chasing this dream would only set me up for more humiliation. What if I failed? What if I tried and proved everyone right? That I wasn't smart enough, that I wasn't strong enough, that I wasn't meant for more than scraps of work and secondhand clothes. Failure seemed almost worse than not trying at all, because at least if I didn't try, I could keep the dream intact, untarnished by reality. But deep down, I knew I couldn't stay still. The idea of living the same life forever, clocking in and out of dead-end jobs, scraping by with no hope of escape, terrified me more than the fear of failing. I told myself that even if I stumbled, even if I didn't make it far, at least I would know I tried. So I pushed forward, even when my steps felt shaky. I filled out applications with trembling hands, researched scholarships until my eyes blurred, and clung to the small, flickering hope that maybe there was a place for me beyond the narrow world I had always known. Those months were filled with a strange mix of desperation and determination. I was caught between the weight of doubt and the light of a dream that refused to go out. I didn't know if I would succeed, but I knew I couldn't let the voices of my past decide my future. And so, with little more than stubbornness and scraps of courage, I kept moving forward. I chased the dream, even as doubt whispered that it would break me. Because deep down, I already knew the truth. Staying where I was would break me even more. There is a point in every struggle when survival stops feeling like resilience and starts feeling like punishment. For me, that point came during the first months I lived on my own. When I finally left home, it wasn't because I was ready. It was because I couldn't take it anymore. I walked away with little more than a backpack, a handful of clothes, and the illusion that freedom alone would be enough to save me. But freedom has a cruel edge when you have no safety net, no support, and no resources. It didn't take long before the reality of independence crushed me. The small apartment I found was barely more than 4 walls and a door that didn't lock properly. The windows rattled when the wind blew, the plumbing leaked, and the nights felt colder than I ever imagined. Rent swallowed almost everything I earned, leaving me with just enough for cheap food, if I was lucky. More often than not, I stretched packets of instant noodles into meals, drinking water to quiet the gnawing in my stomach. Hunger became a constant companion, the kind of hunger that carved hollows in my body and made it hard to think. There were days when I walked past grocery stores and felt shame burn through me, because even the cheapest bread felt out of reach. I worked shifts that bled into one another, cleaning, carrying, scrubbing, just to keep a roof over my head, but no matter how hard I pushed myself, it was never enough. The exhaustion was relentless. I came home from work with aching muscles and blistered hands, collapsing onto a mattress that was little more than a thin layer of foam on the floor. Sleep never came easy. Some nights, I lay awake, counting the cracks in the ceiling, trying not to let the fear consume me. Fear that I would lose even this fragile shelter. Fear that I would slip further down into a place I couldn't climb out of. What hurt most wasn't just the poverty. It was the loneliness. I had walked away from my family hoping to find peace, but instead I found silence. No one checked in. No one asked how I was surviving. In their eyes, I had already failed, and they took a certain satisfaction in my absence. I was out of sight, and therefore unworthy of thought. Those months dragged me down to a place I had never been before. My dreams of college, of escape, of building a better life, all of it felt impossibly far away. I was too busy fighting to make it through each day to imagine a future. I stopped believing in promises to myself. I stopped believing in much of anything at all. Rock bottom wasn't one moment. It was a slow erosion, a steady wearing down of hope until all that remained was survival. And yet, in that darkness, something stubborn kept me moving. I had nothing left to lose, but maybe, just maybe, that meant I still had something to fight for. Rock bottom changes you in ways nothing else can. It strips you bare, takes every illusion you once held, and forces you to see yourself with brutal honesty. For me, it was the first time I realized that no one was coming to save me. If I wanted a different life, I would have to build it with my own two hands. The shift didn't happen overnight. It wasn't a sudden spark of inspiration or a dramatic moment of clarity. It was slower, quieter, like a stubborn ember refusing to die out even when the wind tried to smother it. One morning, I simply got tired of the taste of failure in my mouth. I was sick of rationing noodles, sick of counting coins, sick of believing the lies that I wasn't capable of more. I threw myself into work. Not the dead-end shifts that drained me without offering growth, but opportunities that would move me forward, even if only by inches. I enrolled in community college with money I didn't really have, piecing together grants and small scholarships, working nights and weekends to cover the gaps. Every day felt like a balancing act between exhaustion and determination. Classes became my lifeline. For the first time, I sat in rooms where people expected me to learn, not fail. I studied until my eyes blurred, filled notebooks with messy handwriting, and forced myself to believe that intelligence wasn't something you were born with, it was something you built, word by word, page by page. Each test I passed, each paper I finished, became proof that I wasn't defined by the ridicule I had grown up with. The work outside the classroom was just as relentless. I kept jobs that most people would consider unbearable because I couldn't afford to quit. But instead of letting them drain me, I treated them as stepping stones. Every shift was fuel for tuition, every paycheck a reminder that I was inching closer to something better. It wasn't glamorous. I was exhausted more often than not, surviving on caffeine and grit. There were still nights when I lay awake, wondering if it was all worth it. But beneath the doubt, a new strength was forming. I wasn't just enduring anymore, I was climbing, slowly, painfully, but climbing nonetheless. The turning point wasn't a single event. It was the accumulation of small choices, the decision to keep moving even when everything in me wanted to give up. It was the realization that I had already survived the worst, and if I could survive that, then maybe, just maybe, I could build a life where survival wasn't the only goal. Looking back, I see that was the moment my story began to shift. I wasn't out of the darkness yet, but for the first time, I believed there might be light at the end of it. Years passed in a blur of work, study, and exhaustion. I rarely had time to pause, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, the pieces of my life began to fit together. One small success at a time, I was building a foundation that no one had ever believed I could. The day I graduated from college, I didn't have a crowd cheering for me. No family waiting with flowers, no proud faces searching for me in the sea of students. I walked across that stage alone, but I carried a victory that felt larger than anything I had ever known. For once, I didn't feel like the invisible child or the family's humiliation. I felt like someone who had survived the impossible. That degree didn't solve everything overnight, but it opened doors. I secured a steady job, not glamorous, but stable. It was enough to pay my bills on time, enough to replace secondhand clothes with things that actually fit, enough to breathe without the constant weight of financial panic. For the first time in my life, I had a sense of stability. Stability soon turned into progress. I saved diligently, clinging to every dollar because I knew how fragile it all could be. Years of hunger and scarcity had taught me discipline, and I refused to slip back into the chaos I had fought so hard to escape. With every paycheck, I built a cushion, a small piece of security that no one could take from me. Eventually, that discipline led to something I had never imagined possible. I bought a house. It wasn't large, it wasn't luxurious, but it was mine. The moment I held the keys in my hand, I felt something I had never felt before. ownership not just of a building, but of my life. I had gone from sleeping on couches and rationing noodles to having a front door that locked, walls that belonged to me, and a space I could finally call home. It should have been a private victory, something I could savor in peace. But success has a way of attracting attention, especially from people who once dismissed you. Word spread, as it always does. My family, who had ignored my struggles, who had mocked my efforts, suddenly became aware that I had achieved something tangible. Their reactions weren't pride or happiness. It was shock first, then envy, and finally, something darker. For years, they had branded me the failure, the one destined to scrape by forever. Now, I had done what none of them expected. I had built a life they could no longer laugh at. And that shift changed everything. I wasn't invisible anymore, not because they finally saw me as a person, but because they saw me as an opportunity. What I didn't realize then was that my success, the very thing I thought would finally earn respect, would instead ignite a new kind of conflict, one that would test me in ways poverty never had. The first signs came quietly, almost disguised as coincidence. A message here, a call there. Family members who had ignored me for years suddenly remembered my number. At first, it was framed as casual interest, but beneath the thin surface of politeness was the unmistakable weight of expectation. They hadn't come back into my life to reconnect. They came because they had discovered I was no longer struggling. What began as subtle hints quickly evolved into pressure. The questions circled around the same point. What was I doing with my money? What was I doing with my house? What was I doing for them? Their voices, which had once been filled with ridicule, now dripped with entitlement. I could feel it in every interaction, the belief that because I had climbed out of poverty, I owed them the rope I had used. It was a strange reversal. The very people who had laughed when I failed, who had shaken their heads at my ambition, now spoke as if my accomplishments were theirs by right. It wasn't pride in me, it was possession of me. To them, my success wasn't my own. It was a resource to be harvested, a prize they had been waiting to collect. The guilt they laid on me was relentless. Every reminder of family was sharpened into a weapon. They acted as though the years of neglect, of mockery, of abandonment were irrelevant now that I had something to give. It was as if history could be erased with a single phrase, "Blood is blood." I felt the walls of my hard-won peace begin to tremble. Each message, each call, carried a heaviness that pulled me back into the past I had fought to escape. I had worked so long to build stability, yet suddenly I was being asked to surrender it, not out of generosity, but out of obligation. The demands were cloaked in righteousness, as though denying them would prove I was ungrateful for simply surviving. The pressure became suffocating. I had spent years living with hunger, with exhaustion, with humiliation. But this was a different kind of weight. This was the realization that no matter how far I climbed, my family would always try to drag me back down, not out of love, but out of resentment. They hadn't cheered for me when I was invisible, and now that I was visible, they only saw what they could take. For the first time, I understood the true cost of success. It wasn't just the hours of work or the years of sacrifice. It was facing the uncomfortable truth that my achievements didn't make me safe. They made me vulnerable. I had fought so hard to rise above poverty, but I had never imagined the fight that would come after, the battle to protect what I had built from the very people who once swore I would never have it. And that battle was only beginning. The pressure finally reached a point where silence was no longer possible. For weeks, I had tried to deflect, to set quiet boundaries, to convince myself that the demands would fade if I ignored them. But they didn't fade. They grew. The calls became sharper, the messages more insistent, and the sense of entitlement bled into every corner of my life. Eventually, I could no longer hide behind avoidance. I had to face the truth. If I didn't draw a line, they would take everything I had worked for. So, I stood firm. I chose myself. I decided that my sacrifices, my sleepless nights, my years of hunger and humiliation had earned me the right to finally live without being drained by those who had never lifted me up. The moment I made that decision, everything shifted. My family didn't just disagree, they turned on me. The masks of politeness slipped, replaced by venom that had always been there, waiting beneath the surface. The same mouths that once called me useless now spat accusations of selfishness, of betrayal. In their version of the story, I was the one who had abandoned them. My years of invisibility, my struggle, my survival, none of it mattered. To them, I was nothing but ungrateful. It wasn't just words. The betrayal cut deeper. Rumors began to spread. Twisted lies designed to paint me as cold and heartless. Neighbors whispered. Extended relatives shook their heads, and I became the villain in a narrative carefully crafted by those who once mocked me for being poor. They recast my success as cruelty, my independence as arrogance. And then came the intrusion. Some of them began showing up uninvited, lingering near my house as if my home was theirs to claim. The very place that had once symbolized safety and freedom now felt contaminated by their shadow. I locked doors, closed curtains, and carried the uneasy weight of knowing that my sanctuary was no longer mine alone. The confrontation wasn't a single explosion. It was a slow, suffocating unraveling. Each attack chipped away at me, testing the resolve I had built over years of survival. I had thought I had left behind the hunger and humiliation, but betrayal brought back a familiar ache, one that gnawed at my chest in a way even poverty never had. Yet beneath the pain, a hard truth crystallized. This was not about love or loyalty. This was about control, about possession, about keeping me in the role they had always wanted me to play, the shadow, the failure, the one who owed them everything. By refusing to surrender, I wasn't betraying them. I was finally breaking free. That realization didn't erase the hurt, but it gave me strength. I could endure their lies, their hostility, their attempts to drag me down, because I knew the truth. For the first time, I saw them clearly. They were not family in the way I had always longed for. They were chains, and I was finally learning how to break them. Walking away from my family was not easy. Cutting ties with people who share your blood feels unnatural, like tearing out a piece of yourself. For a long time, I carried the weight of guilt, wondering if I had been too harsh, wondering if I had abandoned them the way they once abandoned me. But over time, the silence they left behind stopped feeling heavy. It began to feel like peace. In that quiet space, I discovered something I had never truly known before: freedom. For the first time in my life, my home was mine. My victories were mine. My future was mine. Without the constant drain of manipulation, I could finally breathe. I could finally build. And I did. I surrounded myself with people who cared for me, not because of what I could give them, but because of who I was. Friends who became family, mentors who believed in me, a community that saw value in me long before my relatives ever did. They reminded me that family is not always the people you are born into. It is the people you choose, the ones who stand beside you without asking for anything in return. Looking back, I realized that the greatest gift I ever gave myself was walking away. My story is not about being saved by anyone else. It is about learning to save myself. I was mocked for being poor, ridiculed for dreaming, and betrayed when I finally succeeded. But in the end, I built a life on my own terms. And if you've ever felt the same, know this: you can too. You can break free, you can rebuild, and you can find your own family. If this story resonated with you, make sure to subscribe, because there are more stories to tell, and you won't want to miss them.